Good morning, U.S. history folks. We are continuing in our last unit, talking about the entrance into modern times. You can see we have Reagan, Clinton, and Obama, the three two-term presidents, starting in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And we are going to move into the changing of America's role on the foreign stage, 15.2. Now you're going to recognize a lot of this. We've talked about this in the other decades, in the 80s, some of the presidents, but we're going to talk about them in terms of how they've shifted the way America is seen around the world, whether it's Latin America, whether it's in Africa, Europe, or just globally. Lots of big, important moments in terms of war, economic, social. So let's break this down. We're going to break this up by areas. So notice first we talk about changes in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Western Hemisphere basically is North and South America. And when you think of North and South America, it can kind of be broken into three pieces, loosely based. You can think about Canada, United States, and then you oftentimes refer to Latin America, which is Mexico, Central America, and everything in South America. Many Latin-based countries. But in this instance, when we're talking about the NAFTA, we're talking about the North American Free Trade Agreement. So now we're only talking about the Northwest Hemisphere, Canada, United States, and Mexico. And basically what happens in the 90s is we drop the tariffs, we drop the borders that had kind of limited trade and defined trade and made some things worth more, some things worth less over the years. And we basically made it to where it was free trade. So instead of, for instance, American farmers being protected, their crops, so they grow corn in Iowa, and they grow corn in Mexico. Well, a Mexican farmer's corn is typically going to be cheaper than a farmer in Iowa. Most Mexican farms are very small scale sort of deals. They're not the over mechanized, plus all the huge loans, etc., that have gone out with a lot of these bigger, large-scale farms. And so a lot of corn from Mexico was cheaper. Well, how did you protect the American farmer from the farmer from outside America? Well, you used tariffs. Tariffs are a wall. And so that's how you would keep Americans buying American. Well, now that we have free trade with Mexico, tariffs are gone. And once the tariffs are gone, people are going to buy from Mexico, etc., or from Canada or whatever. So the other thing that happens is jobs start to move. Factories in America realize I could pay workers in a lot of these Latin American countries a lot less money than I could pay them if they worked in America. Standard of living isn't as high, the expectations aren't as high, the labor movement is not as advanced. So factories start to leave. That's what you see here in this one particular political cartoon. Labor Day, this year's Labor Day picnic will be held in Mexico, where your jobs went. However, it did increase the amount of trade that took place. And so in some ways, people said it was worth it because you have more trade occurring than would have without the free trade agreement. It's only certain parts of the economy that are going to suffer more, because we now in America are going to be able to ship things into Canada and Mexico without having to pay tariffs, etc. Here's an interesting byproduct of this. When you create free trade, they're talking about safety standards in trucks. Well, there's kind of the old adage, that you may know who's driving the truck, but you don't know how inspected the truck is. Some of these big 18-wheelers pulling all these products, and a lot of them were coming in from Latin America without the same standards that they had in the United States. So NAFTA has been controversial from the start. Some industries have prospered because of NAFTA, and some have really, really suffered. There are jobs that have been lost for good. When we lived in North Carolina, there was a lot of textile industry in that region, making cloths, making fabrics, making clothes, and a lot of those places closed down. Jobs left and went to Mexico after NAFTA was passed. And so that changes. Changes how America is seen in the Western Hemisphere. We used to be kind of isolated, kind of on top. Now we're kind of struggling a little bit in some ways. The other example, and we've looked at this before, is the war on drugs. And we've talked about what happened with Manuel Noriega repeatedly. He was the Panamanian military dictator. Notice him wearing the uniform here. And the American government just went in and said, you're not doing that anymore. We're taking you out. And so we arrested him. I mean, look, his U.S. Marshals. This guy was the leader of a country, and he has an American mugshot. So that was America basically saying, we're not going to allow you to have this drug policy, this, all these drug sales, etc., coming out of Panama. It's too important. Panama Canal is too important. Also, at the same time, this is when cocaine started to rise up tremendously coming out of Colombia. For years and years and years, what's Colombia been known for? Coffee. Colombian coffee. Go in a restaurant, you could ask for Colombian coffee. Go in 7-Eleven, you could pour yourself a cup of Colombian coffee. It's usually very dark, very rich, kind of a heartier flavor. Well, look at the graph here. Coffee is blue. Narcotics, cocaine is whatever that is, purple, violet. Notice how similar they are. Look, more coffee, more coffee. This is in the 80s. As you start to move on, look what's happening. Colombia is getting rich, certain Colombians, selling cocaine to the world, not so much coffee. And so that becomes a negative. People want to have this war on drugs. In America, we're dealing with this intense outbreak of drugs. We'll talk in 15.3 about what it's doing to the American prison system. Changes in East Asia. Probably most importantly is China. China and the Tiananmen Square incident. We talked about Tank Man. Well, these are some of the images that were before and after Tank Man. This was a line of protesters that was just run over by a tank, just killed right there on the spot. The Chinese government does not, they're not interested in your opinion. China has very, very heavy censors on their internet. They let very little from the outside world in. There was a few years back, the Chinese had the Olympics in Beijing, the Summer Olympics. And a lot of people are very angry that the Olympic Committee chose China because of all of their inconsistencies and violence and suppression of free speech, etc. Remember FDR's 4 freedoms speech? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear, directed at the Nazis. Well, some people kind of look at China the same way. China is very aggressive in their foreign policy, kind of do things their own way. Zhonghua, Middle Kingdom, they've been this way for centuries. We kicked the door open, and so now they've kind of to reassert themselves. And they had this brutal crackdown on student protests. This is the Boston Massacre and then some. And the United States really didn't do a lot. We kind of said, oh, we don't like that and shouldn't do that, but we're so embedded to them with trade and financial issues. Plus, we're a little intimidated by China. Huge army, huge population, nuclear weapons. And so we're, it's always tough for us to deal with China and what to do with them. And that's not changing as we move into the modern world. We've talked about Africa and Nelson Mandela going through the apartheid movement. Look at this picture. That could be in Selma, Alabama. But these are South African dogs and South African troops and South African protesters. Here's Nelson Mandela basically saying a very Martin Luther King sort of thing. No one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin. You have to learn that, which is very true. There's no reason to hate somebody at birth. Those are things that are taught people, and usually taught in ignorance, which is why education is so important. Educated people tend to understand these things, that Frederick Douglass was, just as intelligent as any white man, or that the Tuskegee Airmen could fly their planes just as good as any white pilot, etc. And America got involved to a certain degree, that we put economic pressure on the South Africans. There's a lot of people, you know, there was sports teams, um, music people who said, "Well, I'm not doing a concert in South Africa until they get rid of apartheid." Oh, we're not gonna play a tournament in South Africa until they get rid of apartheid. You know, kind of like a Montgomery bus boycott feel to it. And the South African government felt the pressure, and eventually it went away. Kind of a different note. There's continually famine issues in Africa. It's a very difficult place to live. Um, Climate issues, um, war issues, religious, you know, fighting, tribal fighting, the, the, the geography itself, whether it's desert or jungle, it's a very hard place to live. And in the 80s, there was a huge famine in Ethiopia. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people were dying. We talked earlier about the We Are the World issue, but you know, look right here. Active food insecurity. Dark red is bad. Gray simply means we don't have any data. You know, we just don't know, or it's not bad enough to register. But look right here. Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya. This, they couldn't feed their population. And that was when the rock stars got together and sang "We Are the World," and um, it was a very difficult time for many outside African nations to decide because what's the old adage? Give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Well, that's all we were doing really. We were giving them food, and then years later it would be an issue again. And so the world's trying to figure out. America's trying to figure out what exactly do we do in Africa? We can't just keep feeding, but who wants the image of the children suffering in poverty and without food? They didn't choose this. And so America's trying to figure out what's our role moving forward in terms of famine relief. And then we talk about genocide. Last time we used the word genocide, we were talking about Hitler and the Holocaust. Geno meaning people, side meaning death, killing of a people. Well, in Rwanda, if you remember the age of imperialism, when the Berlin Conference, led by King Leopold of Belgium, had sliced Africa up like a magnificent cake. When they redrew boundaries, the Europeans didn't pay attention to tribal issues. So you might put two kind of tribal enemies together in the same country, which is exactly what happened in Rwanda, which you can see here is kind of central South Africa. The Hutus and the Tutsis were two tribal groups that were put together in Rwanda, and they hated each other, killed each other for centuries, been fighting against each other. And in about 30 days, about 800,000 Rwandans were killed in a genocide. It was the minority group. Sometimes I switch this to make sure I get this right. The minority group were the Hutus, and the Tutsis were the majority. But the Hutus were in charge, and they wanted to stay in charge, so they killed hundreds of thousands of Tutsis. You could see the skulls, some with bullet wounds in the back of the head. Hundreds of thousands of deaths. And the world basically just kind of yawned and didn't do anything. There was all these promises made after the Holocaust was discovered that the world would never let this happen again, etc. But they did. Some people think, well, it's because it was black people killing black people in Africa. Most Americans and Europeans don't really care about that. And that might be true. There might be some truth to that because the world did not do much. If you listen to this little clip, if you just kind of look it up, it's basically Bill Clinton basically apologizing because we just didn't do enough and do enough in time. Coming out of this, the world started something that they called the Atrocities Prevention Board, the APB. When you think about the police, you send out an APB. It's like the bat signal, that from here on out, they're going to throw up the bat signal anytime there's the fear of a genocide. Well, guys, there's genocides happening today in Syria. Assad is wiping out, groups, ethnic populations that he does not want any want to be around. The Armenians in Turkey, the Kurds are being attacked by Turkish folks in the Middle East. In China, there's a group, I can't pronounce it, but it's a Muslim group out in the Mongolians, Kyrgyzs, who are being attacked by the Chinese government. I mean, these things are still going on. And so moving forward, the United States doesn't want to get heavily involved because anytime you step out, you have the chance to, think about World War II. And, we have the United Nations for a reason. So the United States doesn't know what to do. But you don't want genocide either. Last would be our changes in Africa would be our wars. And we've talked about the Desert Storm War when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and George H.W. Bush created a coalition of countries from around the world. And these countries from around the world all agreed that we're going to get Saddam Hussein out. We don't want to destabilize this region, very volatile region. Remember, the Sunnis hate the Shiites in and around Middle Eastern countries. And we don't want to turn it into a fight for oil. So we're going to go in and restore order. And we did. We militarily, technologically, kicked Saddam Hussein's butt. That's pretty interesting. These are leaflets that would be dropped into behind enemy lines. And it's basically in Arabic telling these guys how to surrender. And when you surrender, there's another leaflet that would be dropped that would show a menu, pictures, like going to a Denny's, the picture menu, and it would show all the food you would eat as a prisoner of war with the Americans. And so all these Iraqi troops who were starving, we would just drop these surrender propaganda. We'll take care of you. We'll let you go home to see your family and kids. We won't kill you. Oh, and by the way, look at all the good food you can eat. And they surrendered, lots of them. And so we were able to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. A lot of people thought we maybe should have just, taken him out, period. Just kept going into Iraq, removed him as president. He's a bad guy, but we didn't, which led to, a little later, the War on Terror. So the first episode here, of course, is 9/11. 9/11, 2001, when some Muslim terrorists hijacked 4 planes, drove 2 of them into the Twin Towers. You can see the explosion here in the second tower. The first tower has already been hit. These explosions were powerful enough. The jet fuel was, flammable enough that it melted enough of the steel structures inside these floors that caused them to collapse upon each other. And once you have the weight starting to collapse, the whole thing goes down, and literally these 2 towers collapse. I mean, this was an unthinkable sort of an idea, that you could walk onto an airplane, kick open the cockpit door, get rid of the pilots, and be able to fly a plane. I mean, that's pretty sound organization, that you can get guys who are intelligent enough to fly a 747 and willing to fly it into a building. A 3rd plane flew into the Pentagon, and a 4th was headed probably for the White House or the Capitol building, until the passengers on board found out what was going on through text messages, decided to take over the plane, and it crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Thousands of people were killed in the explosions and the attacks, and it changed America. I mean, it was a Pearl Harbor type attack. The difference was who did it. You can't point the finger at a nation. Who do you declare war on? You can't declare war on a country because a country didn't do this. These are terrorist groups. Now, terrorist groups can sometimes be harbored or protected by a country. They can sometimes be given money and supported by a country. But a lot of them are very mobile. They're kind of a guerrilla warfare type feel to them, that they come out and do certain things and they go back into the public life. They kind of become almost invisible. We talk about terror cells that have not been activated. They just lie underground. And so the United States did not know who to hit. Old country song about how Uncle Sam got mad and he stood up, he's ready to raise a fist. Who do you punch? Well, the first country we decided to punch was Afghanistan, because Afghanistan had housed Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden was the leader of Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda was the group that was taking um, credit, so to speak, for these explosions, for these hijackings, for 9/11. And so we just went into Afghanistan and took out Al Qaeda, the Taliban. You know, it was not an easy deal, as you can see. Uncle Sam trying to get out of Afghanistan as soon as possible because he realized it's a graveyard of other countries. Remember what happened to the Soviet Union? Um, and this is a place where Sharia law, here's someone being, executed in the middle of the street by some Al Qaeda, Taliban type folks. And so it was, these people have been growing opium, poppy for years, and that's just what they want to do. And so Americans, we went into Afghanistan and fought this bloody, tough war to get rid of Al Qaeda. And then we decided that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. There was some really bad intelligence that was put forth that showed that Saddam Hussein was preparing weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and we couldn't let a psycho dictator have those. And so George W. Bush, the son, decided to send America into Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein. He said, show us the weapons. He's like, there are no weapons. And so we went in and we fought a very intense, difficult war in Iraq, removed him. He was actually killed by some of his own people, um, but he was removed. And so we started democracy. Look at this great picture of this Iraqi lady who's got ink on her finger because that's how they would vote. They'd give them an ink on her finger and she would push it down so her fingerprint would be her vote. Well, the idea of voting at all in a Middle Eastern country like Iraq or Afghanistan was radical, but even more so for a woman. Here's this soldier trying to, help this child, reaching out to the people kind of like we did in Vietnam, where you're trying the best you can to win the hearts of the populace, but knowing that there's terrorists underneath. The war on terror changed America. A lot of people felt like we never should have gone, we should have stayed at home. But again, 9/11, how do you protect yourself from those kinds of attacks? And it changed America's prestige. We struggled here. We weren't seen as the evil or as the easy winner like maybe we were in World War II. It got us more involved in more events, but it also has kind of caused us to have those Vietnam type, we don't want to get stuck feelings. It's probably what's kept us out of Syria. Okay, changes in Europe. Well, if you remember the Balkans, this region in the map down here, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Macedonia, Albania. So before World War I, that was called the powder keg of Europe. Very volatile region, lots of ethnic diversity, religious diversity. You have both types of Muslims, you have Jews, you have Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholics, lots of diversity, and lots of years and years and years of hatred and warfare, etc. Well, during the Cold War era, the Soviet Union controlled so much of the Balkans that they just kind of kept their foot on them. You didn't raise your fist about, Eastern Orthodox versus Sunni Muslim, whatever, because the Soviet Union was standing on your neck. Well, once the Soviet Union breaks apart, now there's a huge power vacuum as each one of these groups tries to assert their control over the country. And one way that a few groups tried to assert their control was trying to wipe out the rest. You had Serbians, led by these guys over here. These are the bad guys wanted for war crimes. Remember that term? These Serbians were wiping out Bosnians. Just ethnic Serb, it was cleansing, ethnic cleansing of Serbs. Sorry, these are Bosnians wiping out Serbians. And it was, you can see the mass graves. And the United States did try and get involved. The United Nations did try and get involved. but very tentatively because again, you just didn't know what to do. At one point, we created a no-fly zone where they weren't allowed to fly over, and we basically said, y'all want to kill each other, you're gonna have to do it on the ground with your bare hands. You're not gonna be able to use your military advantage. These Bosnians that ran the military. We just tried to make it more of a fair fight, but it was again, we didn't want to get involved in another big major war. Trying to realize that the Balkans are a powder keg, and so the United States only got involved tentatively, very tentatively. The rise of the European Union. During the 90s, Europe became, in a certain way of looking at it, one country economically. You don't have lira and Deutschmarks and pounds and francs, all the different types of money. Now you just have euros. They went through their own NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, in which they dropped borders and refused, stopped paying tariffs and allowed for faster access. Think about it in Europe. Every time you cross borders, you have to change to a different currency before the European Union. It'd be like changing money if you cross into Georgia, then changing money and having South Carolina money, and then changing, because Europe, to a certain degree, is kind of like America in terms of size. Every European country is kind of like an American state. And that would be very inefficient, that you would have to stop your trucks every truck would have to stop at the border to Georgia to get searched, and then it'd have to get stopped again in South Carolina to get searched, and stopped again in North Carolina to get searched. And so basically what the European Union was trying to do was speed up trade. Well, some people thought it worked. It kind of brought them closer together, but some people have struggled with it. There are poor nations like Greece as a nation declared bankruptcy. The country of Greece declared bankruptcy, not a business, the nation. And on the other side, you've got Germany and England, whose economies are just killing it. And so there is kind of an issue with this. A few years back, we started to have waves of people fleeing, places like Syria because of the civil war. And a lot of these people who were fleeing were trying to get to Europe so they could get to the richer places like Sweden and Germany and the United Kingdom. Well, the issue was they'd come into the poorer countries and then find their way to the richer countries. Well, the richer countries were kind of like, yeah, we don't want them. And the poorer countries were like, well, we don't want them. And so, some of the images you've seen of people, immigrants, the little baby child who was washed up on the shore, looked like he was sleeping, but no, he was dead. That was because they were trying to get into Europe. And the European Union was trying to work together. They actually came up with quotas. Every nation had to take a certain number of them. The European Union, to a certain degree, is breaking apart. Europe, I don't know if you've heard the term Brexit, British exit, but Britain voted a year ago to leave the European Union. They're like, it's not working to our advantage. It's not helping us. We're paying all the bills and getting none of the reward. And so it'll be interesting to see moving forward, does the European Union stay together? Last but not least, and this isn't necessarily Europe, this is kind of global, obviously, global warming, but what is America going to do with the whole idea of climate change and global warming and pollution crisis, etc.? You can see this picture here of China. China's going through what the United States went through at the turn of the century with the rise of industrialization in the 1950s as well, where their industrial output is huge. Well, look at one of the problems. These are people riding to work in China. This isn't fog. This is pollution. It's why they're wearing the mask. You don't wear a mask if it's fog. And so we're over-polluting the world. There's no doubt about it. Are we changing the climate? Well, people don't know for certain. There's science that can tell you one way or the other. But for sure, the United States is going to have to make a decision on where do we stand. Are we going to become more climate earth friendly? Are we going to ignore it? Are we going to say it's not a problem? If we decide to make changes, are we going to try and force other nations to make changes? We won't trade with you until you make electric cars. That sort of a thing. But obviously, this is a huge issue. There's only one planet, and we can't go find another one. And so our role moving forward in global change or climate change will be important as well. Okay, so this wraps up 15 point 2